these two periods each have their own respective critical periods. This period of life has a lot of growth happening. Thus, we should be expecting a lot of changes in our different body systems. So we'll start with the skeletal system, keep our same pattern that we started with in the prenatal period. But we had mentioned that there are primary ossification centers in the center or midpoints of long bones specifically, right? And then once we are born and have kind of this general bone shape that's been created by our primary ossification centers, we rely on secondary ossification centers at the end of long bones, which is generally along this epiphyseal line that is noted in the figure. Okay, there's another one down here, but we don't have kind of that cross section of the bone. But we're gonna have secondary ossification centers at the end of our long bones that are going to allow for bone growth lengthwise. And again, these secondary ossification centers, or this at the end of these long bones, is specific to long bone growth, which, if you think about it, these are femur, our tibia, fibula, our metacarpals, metatarsals, humerus, radius, ulna, right? Any of our phalangeal joints, or not joints, phalangeal bones, etc. Okay, so long bones do make up quite a few bones out of the body. We're going to have these secondary ossification centers that allow for endochondral ossification, which is just a fancy word for bone growth in the lengthwise direction. It occurs in long bones only. For all of the other bones in the body, such as carpals, tarsals, our skull, what else am I missing? Our patella. Okay, anything that's not long bones typically is going to primarily rely on appositional growth, or bone growth in girth, from the center outward. So long bones can also experience appositional growth, but it's going to happen kind of in this diaphysis area for the most part. And the process is just a little bit different than endochondral ossification. Okay. During adolescence, your growth plates are going to harden and fuse with the shaft of the long bone. So after adolescence, that's usually why you have a plateau in your height, right? Because those bones are no longer building on top of each other, and you have a bone that is a fixed length. The only thing that changes, as we talked about last week, is the cartilage between bones, which can wear down over time, right? Or if we're looking at vertebra, the fibrocartilage can wear down over time, and then we end up shrinking with age. But you can see this epiphyseal line here is generally where we have cartilage. And actually, I'm going to skip to the next slide because I have a better figure of this. So I think this is a good example of prenatal to adolescence development of bone. So we have a cartilage model that kind of has some bone cells that have started to form, but we can see there's this primary ossification center, and we're growing bone outward. Once we start getting a more consistent blood supply, we can start building bone faster, because blood carries certain nutrients and minerals that are going to help with the ossification process. And more or less at birth, this is what our bones look like. Okay, and this is when we start to shift away from that primary ossification center to our secondary ossification centers, which is this little line of cartilage, right? You can see epiphyseal plate cartilage as a label in this figure. But from those, if you think chondral is referring to cartilage, endo just means inside. So inner cartilage is ossifying or turning into bone. So endochondral ossification is the process of turning cartilage into bone. Anatomy words, man, they just make it so easy to, everything makes sense. So basically what we do is we just build outwards, and we take cartilage from these underlying areas, build bone. underneath, and we just keep moving outwards until we get to puberty, in which there are certain processes that happen that cause these bone plates to fuse or harden completely, in which case cartilage is no longer being produced at those areas, therefore there is no more converting cartilage to bone. Okay. But this is a good illustration of the process that we have from prenatal development, which is kind of these first 4 structures, all the way up through adolescence until we get these hardening of the epiphyseal plate. Then we can talk about the muscular system. Right, so at about 1 year of age, the distribution of muscle fiber types is similar to that of an adult. So remember we said that at birth, usually about 15% of your muscle fibers in total and about 15% of type 2 fibers that have already differentiated are generally undifferentiated. Okay, so by the year of age, most of your muscle fiber types have differentiated into what they are going to be for the rest of your adult life. And once a fiber type has been defined, it stays that way. So for those of us who are wishing that we could run a mile, like me, it's not in the cards unless I really try to train for it. But anyways, I have no control over the types of muscle fibers that I have in my body. Okay. There are sex differences in skeletal muscle mass. So generally in childhood, males have slightly greater muscle mass than females do. In adolescence, this gap increases to where males increase their muscle mass from the start of puberty through about age 17, in which their muscle mass accounts for about 54% of their body weight. For females, we get the same thing where we're increasing muscle mass through about 13, or we're starting to increase muscle mass from puberty through about 13 years of age. So if you remember, the start of puberty for males was more or less around 11 years old, so they have, give or take, about 6 years of time that they are increasing their muscle mass, right? For females, they usually started puberty around 9 or 10, and they stop around 13 years. So if you do the math, that's about 4 years on average, right? 3-4 years of muscle building, which is half of what males get time-wise, right? So male muscle development is 2 times longer than females. And this is largely due to testosterone, right? So some of you who have studied more exercise physiology will know that testosterone is an anabolic hormone. When we think about metabolism, right, there's 2 components. There's catabolism, which is breaking down materials, versus anabolism, or anabolic processes, which are building up materials. And metabolism is kind of this nice balance between those 2 things. So during puberty, testosterone starts to get released from, we'll talk about this when we get to our endocrine function, but testosterone starts to be released from our endocrine system. For males specifically. Females also produce some level of testosterone, but it's just not as in high quantities, right? So males get this flux of testosterone that's going to start kind of promoting all of these anabolic processes with muscle tissue. That prolonged over about 6 years is going to lead to their relatively large increase in muscle mass. So sex differences, and we can already see a linkage of our muscular system and our endocrine system together. Also, skeletal muscle mass can be influenced by physical activity. This is actually something I don't think the book mentioned, but is something that I like to bring up as a little extra something in there, because that physical activity has a direct linkage between the muscular and the skeletal system. So when we exercise, our muscles are pulling on our bones, right? And that is called mechanotransduction. And basically what happens is that stress put on the bones communicates some chemical message to our bone cells that say, oh my God, we're under stress, we need to build more structure, build the wall, right? So I did not mean to make that sound political. But anyways, the bone cells are like, oh my God, we need to build more because we're under a lot of this stress. The more stability we have, the better. So physical activity or using muscles is directly going to also impact our skeletal system, while also increasing muscular strength. So the more you use your muscles, kind of the better your muscle mass will be, but also the better that your bone structure will be. Anyways, that was kind of like a little side note. Fun fact. We also have cardiac muscle growth, which is our heart, but very, very important. And cardiac muscle growth follows a sigmoid curve. The ratio of heart volume to body weight stays relatively constant throughout major growth periods, though. And we can think about this as kind of being a functional growth, because if our heart just grew in a linear way, essentially we're just gonna be pumping a lot more blood than we technically need. So our heart grows as our body grows, so that the amount of blood that's being supplied to our organs and tissues and muscles, etc., is proportional to the tissue or the amount of tissue that we actually have. So that part should generally make sense. And then obviously, like, the longer or taller your extremities are, probably the larger your heart muscle is going to be, because it has to produce a more forceful squeeze or pump in order to get that blood all the way out to your extremities. Okay, so cardiac muscle growth is fairly proportional to the rest of your physical growth patterns. All right, and then we have our adipose system. Birth to 6 months, typically there's a very rapid increase in fat mass, and generally infants will reach their highest peak weight velocity in the first month of life. So, I mean, that's where you get like the little Michelin babies, where they've got so many rolls you kind of can't distinguish where their joints are sometimes. Around 6 months after that rapid increase in fat mass occurs, all the way through kind of the later end of childhood, you have more of a gradual increase in fat mass. Girls usually have a greater overall fat mass than boys, and BMI, or level of body fat percentage, are relative precursors for body fat percentage later in life. So that's why we have kind of this emphasis on childhood obesity in current times, as well as recent, or kind of more recent past years, is because the kind of the likelihood that these different relationships that have been established between childhood obesity and adulthood obesity are very, very strong connections. Okay, so the more active we try to make children in childhood can have a really positive impact on the activity levels that they might experience as an adult. At least that's the running theory. In childhood, specifically, visceral fat increases at a faster rate than subcutaneous fat. So I have a picture on the right-hand side to kind of distinguish the differences between visceral and subcutaneous fat. You can see these two things in the abdomen, which is what's pictured here, are separated by the abdominal muscle layer. So visceral fat refers to any fat that accumulates around organ tissues. And then subcutaneous fat is sub meaning under, cutaneous meaning skin, so it's just the fat layer that's under the skin, or under the dermal layers. But both of these are different, and both of them have different impacts on health. So childhood visceral fat's going to increase primarily for organ protection and kind of generally making up what our adult structure should be like. And then subcutaneous fat actually decreases during childhood, which is a very interesting phenomenon. And then during adolescence, we kind of have this flip of the decrease in subcutaneous fat is going to increase until about 12 years for both genders. And then after that, we have kind of this continual increase for girls and then a decrease for boys in this subcutaneous fat specifically. During this adolescence period, though, for girls, it's a general, there's a difference between where we have the subcutaneous fat increasing or decreasing. So everyone is increasing subcutaneous fat until about 12 years, and then once we kind of hit that adolescent period, there's going to be a steady increase in subcutaneous fat in the trunk and the extremities for females, which, we end up having like breast enlargement, as well as kind of more of like the hip and thigh fat that build up as a result of hormonal changes. And then for boys, generally there's a decrease in subcutaneous fat throughout kind of mid-adolescence. And then subcutaneous fat is more so maintained or added at the trunk rather than the extremities. So girls build subcutaneous fat at the trunk and extremities. Boys, more so their midsection than their extremities. Again, there's also potential genetic factors that could play a role in where you put on fat more, but these are kind of the general areas and trends that have been noted in research. Since the two major periods of fat cell hyperplasia are at about 6 months in the onset of puberty, these periods are typically linked to kind of the critical control of obesity later in the lifespan. And another thing to note is that once fat cells are made, they can remain empty or they can fill up when they're needed. So at these critical periods, if we're building too many fat cells or we have too much proliferation of our adipose tissue at that 6-month period, as well as kind of the onset of puberty, we're technically making it so that we're providing available space to gain more adipose tissue later in the lifespan, right? Because if fat cells can remain empty or they can fill up with more contents, right? It's basically like saying, I have 5 Tupperware containers for food or leftovers. They can remain empty or they can fill up, right? If I naturally have a rotation of about 3 Tupperware containers for the leftovers that I have in my fridge, right? Those extra 2 Tupperware containers can remain empty or we can fill them up, right? So you can kind of think about it in that sense that if those fat cells are empty, they still have potential to fill up later in life, which could lead to kind of overweight status or obesity. So 2 critical periods for the adipose system. All right, then we have our endocrine system. Again, the endocrine system is extremely complex and also plays a very delicate role in the growth and the development of children, especially adolescents, which I'm pretty sure everyone in this class is familiar with the lovely fluctuations that hormones give us. But there are 3 primary types of hormones that are critical to development. So those are the 3 that we're going to focus on. The first of those being growth hormone, which makes sense in terms of development. But this growth hormone is going to influence growth by stimulating anabolic processes. Remember, anabolic means that we're building things. It's under the control of the central nervous system and is released by the anterior pituitary gland, which resides in the brain. Absence or deficiency of growth hormone can lead to growth abnormalities. So again, these abnormalities will be more noticeable in more critical periods of growth. And growth hormone is also fueled by insulin, which is another hormone that is produced by the digestive system, specifically by the pancreas. And that is triggered when we eat sugar or glucose. Insulin, in terms, I had an extra note on that and I just blanked for a second. But insulin primarily is going to function for carbohydrate metabolism. It stimulates the transport of glucose. So, like I said, when we have rises in blood glucose, the pancreas has different cells that are going to say, hey, we need to get rid of this blood glucose if it's too high, right? And that insulin is going to kind of help shuttle glucose to muscle tissue as well as our liver and fat cells. And that glucose is kind of necessary for protein synthesis and also the functioning of growth hormone at the level of our muscles, which is probably where we want it most. Okay, I think that's all I had to say about this one. Anyways, growth hormone is important for anabolic processes, both with bone, muscle, as well as organ growth. And adipose tissue. It's everywhere. The second most important hormone for development is the thyroid hormones. Yes, there are multiple. We're kind of just going to keep them clumped together as thyroid hormones, though, because they're very complex in their functions. The thyroid gland is in the neck area, and on that thyroid are 4 parathyroid glands, which are like tiny little dots on the posterior end of the thyroid gland. So there are 2 systems that are going to kind of regulate these thyroid hormones. One is the pituitary thyroid system. So that's going to be communication with the pituitary gland in the brain to the thyroid gland. Right? The pituitary is going to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which is going to stimulate the thyroid to release hormones that help regulate different growth processes. So that's one system that we have going on. The other one that the book mentions is the nervous system, the thyroid system. So thyroid stimulating hormone excretion increases or is increased by releasing factor in the hypothalamus. So hypothalamus is also in the brain, actually very close to the pituitary gland, so you can kind of see how those two are regulated together. But that releasing factor in the hypothalamus stimulates thyroid stimulating hormone, right, which again is kind of linked to a lot of different growth processes in relation to bone, sexual maturation, neural maturation, metabolic processes like protein synthesis, and a whole bunch of other body functions. So, strong connection between the central nervous system and the thyroid hormone, and stimulating the thyroid hormone to release different types of hormones that it's responsible for releasing for all of these other different growth processes. The third hormone that is responsible for development, or that is critical to development, are gonadal hormones, which, yay, in terms of adolescence, these are going to be super, super prominent, right? So these are going to be kind of the primary reasons that we have physiological maturation. They're going to stimulate the development of secondary sex characteristics, such as added body hair, breast enlargement, testicular enlargement, being able to produce viable sperm, and having follicular development for females in creating an egg for the sperm to meet with if we have a fertilization process happening, right? So a lot of these hormones are responsible for many of the annoyances that we call puberty, right? But there are sex differences. We already have talked about one of these, that being that males secrete primarily testosterone from the testes and the glands of the adrenal cortex. That's going to kind of promote the increase in muscle mass for males. Females are secreting primarily estrogen from the ovaries, as well as glands from the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex, by the way, is in the kidneys. Renal is referring to kidney function. So that's a big part of our endocrine system. Usually we talk about kidneys a lot when we talk about endocrine. But sex hormones produce both skeletal maturation in both sexes, as well as muscular changes, as well as adipose changes. Typically women gain more adipose tissue when they go through puberty, which is a direct effect of estrogen. versus men who get muscle from testosterone. But both sexes, again, like I want to mention, they both produce testosterone and estrogen, they're just in different proportions. So just because women are not like buff daddies doesn't mean that they don't produce testosterone, and vice versa. Okay. Last thing in childhood and adolescence was we're kind of wrapping up this period of the life span is our nervous system. So remember we said at birth, typically the head weighs about 25% of the body weight, and this was like several weeks ago, but that's because of the brain. The brain is actually the thing that weighs 25% of body weight. This progresses to about 80% of body weight at about 4 years, and then there's steady growth throughout adolescence. So you can see this huge jump, 25% to 80%. You can imagine all of the different neural connections and impressions that we can have on kids and experiences that can be impressed upon kids in that vital period of brain development between birth and 4 years old, which is why I think maybe you guys have seen the commercials where they're like, talk, read, and sing, or engage in different types of activities that are going to stimulate that brain growth. There's also increase in size of neurons by adding glia cells and myelin, right? Which myelin we've kind of already talked about in terms of kind of increasing neural transmission. But glial cells we have a whole bunch of these, like astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, Schwann cells, microglial cells, ependymal cells, which I'm not as familiar with, but those are also listed in this figure. But those are going to be, glial cells are going to help kind of support the regular function of neurons. So they're as equally important as our regular neurons, which comprise the majority of our nervous system. But changes are mostly going to be influenced by learning experiences. So we also have other things such as diet, which kind of, you can imagine if glial cells are producing nutrients and kind of are contributing to the health of our neurons, right? The better our diet is during that time of growth, the better the health of our nervous system should be. But learning experiences are going to be the most important extrinsic factor that are going to contribute to the development of the nervous system during this time period. Also, head injuries during kind of this like birth to 4 years or during childhood or adolescence. So concussions in youth are kind of a big consideration that have been of conversation in recent years. But head injury can also kind of stunt development of the brain. So lots of things to consider, but generally we notice kind of this critical period between birth and 4 years, and then it's pretty steady throughout the rest of adolescence until we finally achieve our adult brain.